Hello, everyone. My name is Markus Krueger. I'm the programming director at the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, our county history museum at the Yumcomb Center. Every year, Lloyd Gunderson asks me if I can come out to Concordia Church to do your famous Memorial Day service to do a talk, but every year I have to decline because it's my wedding anniversary and I'm going to go out of town for that. So instead, this year we sent a few videos. The first video is about what life was like in Clay County 101 years ago today, back before we entered World War I in 1917. I'll take a few minutes here now to tell you some of the stories of the service members from Concordia Lutheran Church during World War I. And after this bit is done, we'll have a movie about how 3 years after he died, a young man from this church was returned here to be buried. These movies were made for our new exhibit at the Yumcomb Center called War, Flu, and Fear, Clay County in World War I. It's on display now through 2019, and I'd like to invite all of you to see it. We focus in this exhibit on two families, the Masterson family of Barnesville and the Thortvedt family, members of your church who are buried just outside. Orbel Thortvedt painted the altar painting here after the tornado destroyed the old church in the 1930s. So the names in the exhibit will be familiar to many of you, and for many of you, they'll be family. I'll start with Signe Lee. So this is her. Signe Lee, who used to sit in these pews here. I've had a special interest in Signe Lee for many years now because after the war, she moved to a nice little house in Moorhead with her sister Selma, and I live in that house now. So I think about her a lot, and it was fun in this exhibit to highlight her interesting experiences as a member of the Army Nurse Corps during World War I. After the war, she gave a scrapbook of her Army Nurse Corps days to the Minnesota Historical Society, and with their permission, we reproduced some of that scrapbook in the exhibit for you to see. Signe was stationed in training camps near San Antonio and Waco, Texas for most of the war. This was actually a dangerous job. Throughout history, more soldiers have died of disease than in combat. In our Civil War, bacteria killed twice as many soldiers as bullets did. And an army camp is the perfect breeding ground for disease. Soldiers from every corner of the country gathered together, packed in close quarters, mixing meningitis from Missouri with influenza from Indiana. Their immune systems were bombarded and overloaded. By 1917, the science of medicine had come a long way. We had better sanitation, we vaccinated our soldiers, we sterilized surgical instruments. Our Army Medical Corps was confident that this war would be different. And then the Spanish Influenza came. It's estimated that 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 human beings on this planet got the flu in 1918 and 1919. About 2.5% of those who got the flu died of it. This is killed maybe up to 100 million people worldwide, more people than the war. Odds are someone in your family probably got the flu. And it's certain that they knew people who died of it, and that in the fall of 1918, they were terrified as the flu shut down our cities, closed our schools, shut down our theaters, and even banned public funerals. Anywhere where people congregated was off limits. 174 people in Clay County died of this flu in 1918 and 1919. Just shy of half of the 64 soldiers from Clay County who died in the war died of disease, mostly of the flu. And Signe Lee was a nurse helping the sick. Signe typically worked as a night nurse and was the head of the meningitis ward during an epidemic in the camp. While in Texas, she befriended the horse of General John Blackjack Pershing, the head of America's armies in France. He left his horse behind in Texas. One day, the horse stepped on Signe's foot, smashing her toe. And I'm sure it hurt like crazy, but it gave her a good story for the rest of her life. I know 100 years later, I'm still telling this story. Signe was on her way to serve in France when the war ended, so instead of going to France, she was stationed in New York and became assistant chief nurse for sick soldiers returning from France. She later helped blind and seriously injured soldiers in Hoboken, New Jersey. And while nursing sick soldiers, she became sick herself. Her illness led to an honorable discharge from the Army and a permanent heart condition. Let's see. So the first boys from this community to go to France were Roy Gorder and Dan Christensen. This is Dan Christensen here. Dan Christensen was an educated farmer who went to school at Ockers Business College, Concordia College, and North Dakota Agricultural College, what we call now NDSU. He played both baseball and basketball in school. He was a great hunter, musically talented, loved to travel, was funny and optimistic, according to his brother. Dan went over in the summer of 1917 with the 1st Infantry Division. They were the first to go over. America planned to send 4 million more soldiers to France, but it would take time to draft the men, train them, and send them over to France. The German army knew that once those 4 million American soldiers got to France, that they'd lose the war. So they had to win the war before those Americans got there. So they launched a series of all-or-nothing offensives in the spring of 1918 in order to destroy the French and British armies before the Americans arrived. And it looked like they were going to pull it off, too. Our ally, the mighty Russian Empire, had just recently collapsed into communist revolution, and they dropped out of the war, which freed up 500,000 German soldiers to fight in the trenches of the Western Front in that big offensive. The massive German attacks broke the Allied lines, and the French and British armies retreated toward Paris, and it didn't look good. But there were a few Americans in France, and Dan Christensen was one of them. And although they had not yet seen combat, the American divisions were thrown into the path of the German army. In June and July 1918, the Americans stopped the German army in a little forest called Belleau Wood, and they refused to be budged from a town called Chateau Thierry. Very few Americans talk about these battles, but to all French people, the names Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry are like what we think of when we say Gettysburg or Bunker Hill. The battles where their American friends paid so dearly to save France. In August, soldier Elmer Gunderson sent a letter home from France that circulated around Moulin Township. Elmer said Dan Christensen was part of that fight, and he lost part of his thumb stopping the Germans. When the Americans stopped the German army at Chateau Thierry, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, supreme commander of the Allied armies, he knew that the Germans were exhausted. So now he thought was the time to turn the tables. So he ordered all the American, French, and British armies to counterattack all along the line. Every man into the fight is what he said. The Germans were taken completely by surprise. On July 21, in that battle, Dan Christensen and the 18th Regiment went over the top, joining this massive counterattack. And they called it the Battle of Soissons, after a name of a nearby town. Dan's fellow soldiers fought hard against the horribly accurate German artillery and machine guns, and many American soldiers died that day. They took their objective, but at the end of the day, Dan Christensen just wasn't there. And he never was found. Dan Christensen's name is inscribed on the wall of the missing in the Ain Marne American Cemetery in France. Meanwhile, 100 years ago, this week, May 25, 1918, Eugene Studleyan and Goodwin Thortfett reported to the Moorhead train station. That's Goodwin. That's Eugene. They were drafted, and this was the day this batch of Clay County soldiers left for Fort Lewis, Washington. Many of us know what it's like to see a loved one leave for war, to the Pacific or to Vietnam or to Iraq. The people of this congregation went to Moorhead 100 years ago, joining a huge crowd of people there to see the boys off. Goodwin's sister Dora Thortfett wrote in her diary that day. At 4:30, she said, the drafted men come. It was an awful moment. The first one I knew was Eugene Studleyan, then Goodwin. They were in the same squad. As soon as all the men were lined up, the band struck up some music. We probably took our last look at Goodwin as he passed us. He looked sad. He's had his raincoat on. I would have given anything if I could have talked to him, but the crowd was too dense. I shall never forget this day. Lots of tears were shed. All the boys were there. We all crowded up to the depot where we couldn't see a thing. As the train rolled on, the band played Over There. Cheers and tears. We watched for known faces. The first one I knew was Louis Jonk, and he was very cheerful looking and waved and cheered. Then Eugene Studlian. I waved to him. He saw me. The train rolled on and is still rolling for 3 or 4 days before it reaches its destination, American Lake, Camp Lewis, Washington. We were all crying until our heads almost split. Adele and I had an awful headache, didn't sleep much. I always pictured the rolling train. Her sister Orabelle Thornfett was there too, and she wrote in her diary, "The Concordia band played, and music always loosens the emotions, and I had to cry. We saw Goodwin nowhere. The crowd thronged and pressed. President Weld and Comstock spoke, and finally the roll call was called. We got close up to the line. Goodwin's name was one of the first as he walked forward and looked right forward. His face was swollen from crying, and it was an awful moment. I looked as hard as I could at him through my tears, and that proved my last look. Oh, it was hard. A person could easily see amongst the people who had dear ones going. Then as Goodwin walked up the line, I heard someone say, 'Goodbye, Goodwin.' Then pretty soon Eugene's turn come. He was very pale and sinking, seemed to reel from side to side as he went up. Then the police put back the crowds from the rails as the big locomotive came clanging up, its monster wheels groaning as they stood, and the men entered the cars for their long ride. Then the engine bell began to dangle, and with a grind the whole train was moving, and it seemed to say, 'Goodwin is going. Goodwin is going.'" Eugene Studlian and Goodwin Thornfett were in the same unit. They stuck together. In fact, they shared the same tent in basic training. These Glendon farm boys traveled and trained together first at Camp Lewis, Washington, then later at Camp Kearney, California. After 2 months training, they were sent off to war. They took a train from the California-Mexico border to the East Coast. Goodwin wrote letters home as he looked at America out the window. Mostly he talked about how crummy the farmland was wherever he was at, and he asked his family how the crops were going. On August 5th, Goodwin Thornfett wrote a letter home from New York. Letters like this were circulated all around to all the neighbors. Maybe your grandparents read this letter. He said, "We was loaded on a boat in Jersey City to Long Island. Went through under all the big bridges. Went first under the Brooklyn Bridge, then all the rest. Seen the Statue of Liberty, the Woolworth Building, and all the rest of the buildings at the same time. It looks great, but it don't seem to interest me any at all. When one has seen the pictures of it once, you can imagine how it looks. Seen some fine country in Illinois, good farming country, some fine farming in Ontario, but the Red River Valley has them all beat, I think." When Goodwin and Eugene got to France, their unit was split up. The men were given to other units as replacements. Goodwin Thornfett, Eugene Studlian, and Reuben Nicklay from Barnesville were able to stay together in the same unit, the 307th Infantry Regiment. The unit was mostly New Yorkers who lost a lot of men in previous fighting, and they needed to get back up to strength for the next big offensive. That offensive was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the biggest offensive we've ever had. Although Americans rarely hear about it, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive is still the biggest, bloodiest battle in American history. It's bigger than D-Day, bigger than Iwo Jima, bigger than Okinawa, bigger than Gettysburg. It started September 12 and it raged until November 11th. The idea was that all along the line from the Swiss border to the English Channel, all the Allied armies would attack and not stop until Germany surrendered. When we think about World War I, we think of mud and trenches, but in this battle, this was in the forest. While the French and British soldiers tried to break the German line to the north, it was up to the Americans to take the dreaded Argonne Forest, which the Germans had been turning into a fortress for 4 years. Half the Americans who died in this war died in the final 47 days during this battle. The same for Clay County. Half the Clay County soldiers who died in this war died in the final 47 days. These dates also coincide almost exactly to the height of the influenza epidemic. On October 4th, 1918, 12 days after arriving on the front line, Goodwin, Eugene, and Reuben Nicklay advanced with their company into the Argonne Forest. After the war, Goodwin Thornfett told his sisters what happened next. Orabelle Thortvedt wrote it down in her diary. Goodwin and Eugene both looked at each other. That was the last look between them as the sergeant said, "Mr. Thortvedt, you may scout ahead." So Goodwin went on ahead, beating his way through the thick underbrush. Others were coming after him in a single file about 50 feet behind. Goodwin proceeding along, keeping a sharp eye out for snipers in the trees and other dangers. Then there was 2 Germans. They ducked, and so did Goodwin. They saw each other at the very same time. Then came the incessant patter-spatter of machine gun fire. Goodwin lay behind a fallen root. The root was not broad enough to protect the whole of Goodwin's body. Goodwin lay as flat as possible, but he had to peep over the root to see if the Germans were coming, and it was God's wonder a bullet did not happen to come along when his head happened to be above the root. Bullets whizzed past his head, burning his ears. Sand and dirt flew in his face, and then he got his in the right elbow. His arm became numb and very painful. Goodwin began to worm his way on his stomach to the rear. He pulled himself along by the aid of his left arm. He expected to get shot any time as bullets came fast and thick. He crawled past a shell hole. There lay one of his friends, Mr. Reuben Nicolay of Barnesville. And when he saw Goodwin was wounded, he said, "Did they get you, Fat?" Eugene's nickname for Goodwin was Fat. Then Goodwin came in a shell hole where the sergeant was. The sergeant gave first aid to Goodwin's wound and also said, "There's one man who will never see the States. He got a bullet right in his forehead. Instantaneous death." Goodwin asked, "Was it Studlian?" The sergeant answered, "No, he is further up." But Goodwin had a premonition that it was Eugene and that the sergeant didn't like to tell Goodwin, and he feels to this day that it was poor Eugene. The sergeant told Goodwin to try his best to get back to the rear. By a miracle, Goodwin got through that terrible space of shot and shell. Eugene Studlian died that day, October 4th, 1918. His friends in his unit would have dug him a grave and said some prayers and marked it probably with a wooden cross with Eugene's name on it. And then they had to move on to continue the fight for the forest. After the war, this unit of New Yorkers put a bronze plaque on a boulder in Central Park, honoring the soldiers of the 307th who died in that war by putting their name on that plaque. So Eugene Studlian's name is there in Central Park in New York City. 4 days after he was killed, Bernard Haegland of this church died. He's buried in the Somme American Cemetery in France, Plot D, Row 5, Grave 11. On November 1st, Melvin Hurl was wounded by a shell fragment. It was him. Melvin was a Moorhead kid, but he was well known around here. He has roots in the families from here. His mom was a Studlian. Melvin went to Moorhead Normal School, which is what we now call Minnesota State University Moorhead. His classmates called him Babe, maybe because of his baby face smile that you see. 3 days after being hit from that shell fragment and 8 days before the war ended, Melvin Hurl died of his wounds in Field Hospital number 114. After the war, returning soldiers formed local chapters of the American Legion. The Moorhead chapter they named after Melvin Hurl. The fighting and killing went on until November 11th when Germany asked for a ceasefire, an armistice. In all world history, there can be very few times when more people felt more joy and more relief than on November 11th, 1918. The news of the war spread like a prairie fire around the world. Word of the peace came to the U.S. at 1:45 a.m. Central Time. And within a half hour, Moorhead Mayor Nels Melvey ordered the fire siren to blow in celebration. Church bells soon joined in and rang throughout the night. Dora and Adele Thortvedt woke up hearing whistles from Moorhead 7 miles away. Everyone knew what it meant. The war was over. In France, at precisely 11 a.m., an eerie quiet fell over the trenches as the guns fell silent. It was followed by an eruption of joy as the soldiers realized they survived the war. Harold Golder from Barnesville wrote home that the best part of it was I was on the front line when the armistice was signed and could see what a blessing peace is. No more shells screaming over your head, bursting within a few feet of you, only a blissful peace over everything. We still celebrate November 11th, as we should. We call it Veterans Day instead of Armistice Day now. Spontaneous celebrations erupted everywhere on November 11th. The streets of Moorhead and Barnesville were filled with parades and cars dragging tin cans, bands played patriotic songs, and the flags of the Allied nations flew everywhere. Dora Thortvedt called the day the greatest realization of joy we have ever known. The Thortvedt sisters drove into Moorhead to join the party. While the girls were in Moorhead, their father, Levi Thortvedt, was at home. The phone rang, and he answered it. It was someone reading him a telegram over a bad phone line. All he could make out was, "Died of flu yesterday." His heart sank. He was frightened. Was it his son Goodwin? He listened further, and he caught the name, Thor Sheridan, his farmhand. They were close. Thor lived and worked with the family for several years. Levi felt relief that his son was still alive for all he knew. But he felt sad for Thor, and maybe a little guilty, feeling relieved that his friend Thor was dead instead of his son. Oscar Thompson, one of the sons of Concordia Lutheran, survived 48 days in the trenches, survived the biggest, bloodiest battle in American history, was wounded by poison mustard gas in the fighting, but he survived. He rejoiced with all the other doughboys at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, when the guns fell silent and the war ended. Oscar Thompson survived the fighting, but he caught the flu, and he died of pneumonia in January 1919. He's buried in Saint-Mihiel American Cemetery in France. A month after the war ended, on December 12, 1918, Ingeborg Thortvedt, the mother of the family, heard the phone ring. A few seconds later, she broke down in sobs. She explained to her children, in Norwegian, that the Studlians had just been informed that Eugene had died 2 months before. The news spread. Many of your family members cried when they heard it. World War I claimed the lives of 116,000 Americans, our third deadliest war after the Civil War and World War II. At war's end, 75,000 American soldiers like Eugene were buried in graves hastily dug by their comrades on battlefields across France. It took 2 years to locate, identify, and move our fallen soldiers into one of the 9 new American cemeteries in Europe. Meanwhile, our government surveyed the Gold Star families. They had the choice of their sons remaining in American cemeteries in Europe or for that soldier to return home to be buried. 15 Clay County soldiers in this war are buried in France, including Bernard Hageland and Oscar Thompson, who used to sit in these pews. Dan Christensen is one of the 2 Clay County soldiers whose name appears on the wall of the missing in France. The families of 28 Clay County soldiers asked for their sons to come home for burial. The movie you'll see next is from the writing of Adele Thortvedt, telling the story of after being buried for 3 years in France, Eugene Studlian came home. The photos that you see in the movie are of his funeral in this church. The family kept the flag that was draped over Eugene's coffin and kept the lock of hair that you'll hear about in the movie. His niece, Solveig Ramstead Berg, donated these items to the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, and you can see them on display at the exhibit when you come. At the end of Adele's writing, she closes with, "He's gone but not forgotten." I want to thank you for not forgetting him or any of these soldiers. I want to thank you for this service so you can tell these stories to the next generation so they don't forget them either. And that's one of the reasons you doing this is, days like this is one of the reasons why Mullen Township and Concordia Lutheran are such special, important places to our history. Thank you.